Bones, Criminal Minds, and more. He was also in his fair share of films between the years 2004 and 2012. You would be surprised to know that he was not into alcohol or drugs or the partying lifestyle, even though he was spending all his time with other actors and actresses in Hollywood, and there was a lot of partying going on, but not for him. That was not his thing. He enjoyed reading and writing, particularly poetry. He loved philosophy, and he enjoyed playing chess. In the mid-2000s, he began dating Katy Perry, and the relationship did not last for very long, but it seems to have left a big impact on Katy Perry, because it is said that 2 of her songs from the Teenage Dream album, The One That Got Away and Circle the Drain, are both about Johnny Lewis. Now, the show that made him famous was Sons of Anarchy. He appeared in the first 2 seasons of that show as Half Sack. That was the name of his character. And it was very successful, and he was doing well. But he was unhappy with the role, and so he asked to be written out of the show. According to Johnny's father, quote, he told us he left because the show was getting into gratuitous violence. He didn't want to communicate that as an artist, end quote. So Johnny was very non-violent, and he never returned to television after that. He was in a few low-budget films, but he kept a kind of low profile. And then he decided that he wanted to take some time off from acting to write a novel, which would be about a young musical genius making his way in San Francisco. And Johnny had plenty of money saved up, so it wasn't an issue for him. But he moved into what was called the Writer's Villa, which was a place where lots of young, struggling actors resided. Now, he was not a struggling actor. He had already made it big and had a successful career already. But he still loved the place. He totally loved the vibe. The property was run by an older woman named Katy Davis. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Katy. She was known as Miss Katy to everyone there, and she was originally from Texas, but had moved to California in 1950. She had attended UCLA and worked in various publishing jobs. Then she got married and had a child. She and her husband had purchased this giant home, which ultimately became known as the Writer's Villa. But by the 1980s, she and her husband had divorced, and her daughter had grown up and moved out, and she was alone in this giant house. She started a very successful career in real estate, and she was renting out rooms to her clients who were searching for a home in the area so they could stay there while they waited to find their perfect house. And then as time went on, it evolved into a sort of bed and breakfast for up-and-coming Hollywood stars. Some of the people who lived there were Val Kilmer, Parker Posey, Paula Santa Monica. And then things started getting worse again. On February 10th, he was arrested for knocking out a man outside of a yogurt shop for no reason. He was released on $20,000 bail. A couple days later, he walked into the ocean in Santa Monica, fully clothed. Luckily, they got him out and he was hospitalized for hypothermia. On February 18th, he was arrested again for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He said he thought it was his friend's house, but it wasn't. And he was released on bail again after that. Over the next few months, his mental condition just continued to deteriorate more and more. His memory had become really bad. His conversations were either extremely basic or he just made no sense whatsoever. So of course he saw doctors and he was prescribed Zyprexa and Abilify, which are used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar. But his father continued to be extremely concerned that they had never really gotten a clear diagnosis. And because of that, the treatment was not necessarily the correct treatment. And as it was, Johnny would not take these meds. So he was unmedicated and basically untreated for whatever it was that was wrong with him. Meanwhile, he had a lot of legal issues, and his lawyer was trying to persuade the courts to let him swap out jail time for going to a treatment center. Now, on May 23rd, 2012, he had been in jail for 2 months, which wasn't making him any better. And they transported him to Ridgeview Ranch, which is in the foothills of Altadena. This was a rehab type place where they had activities like yoga and therapy, meditation, and it's considered a dual diagnosis center. It treats people who have both a substance abuse problem and a psychiatric disorder. And although Johnny was reportedly never into using drugs or alcohol, somehow they managed to get him into this program regardless. And his lawyer was working towards a deal where he would serve out the rest of his sentence at the rehab instead of in a jail. But Johnny didn't like that idea because he felt like his case should be dropped because it was all self-defense. So he fired his lawyer, which the court allowed, and he represented himself, which was a terrible idea because it backfired, and he was sentenced to a year in prison. But luckily, or unluckily, I guess, really, the jails were very overcrowded, and he was released after only 6 weeks. It was supposed to be a year, but out he went after 6 weeks. And that was September 21st, 2012. Johnny asked his father if he could contact Kathy over at the writer's villa and see if he could get an apartment in there again because he really liked it there. And his dad thought, that is a good idea. That place is so peaceful and there's so much support there. So he spoke to Kathy. He did not tell her about all of Johnny's problems. Kathy said, sure thing, we still have his old room and send him over. So on Monday, September 24th, 2012, Johnny moved back into the writer's villa. shut the fuse box at the villa that morning. And Katy had confronted him in some way, telling him he couldn't do that, which really upset him. So he was pacing back and forth outside, and a neighbor by the name of Dan Blackburn was looking out the window at him, like, what is up with that guy? Like, he does not look okay. Why is he pacing? And then sometime later, Johnny went to the door of Dan Blackburn's home, knocked on it, and said he wanted to introduce himself. He said, "I'm your new neighbor," because, he had just moved in 2 days before. And Dan was like, okay, alright, hi, and bye. And then it is believed that after that, he went to Katy's room in the villa and killed her. He strangled her, and he beat her to death. And before I say this next part, if you have problems hearing anything about animals being hurt, skip ahead by like 30 seconds. After he killed Katy, he then went and killed her cat in a similar manner to the way that he killed her. He had beaten Katy so violently that he, quote, fractured her entire skull and obliterated the left side of her face, leaving her brain exposed, end quote. And brain matter was all over the floor around her. So it was an extremely, extremely violent attack. Now, after that, he left Katy's room. He went back outside, back to Dan Blackburn's house, and he started attacking the painter who was outside doing some work. He started violently beating the painter, and Dan's wife started screaming for Dan to come out and help. So he came out. He tried to intervene. He tried to stop Johnny, and Johnny started beating Dan as well, and he had like superhuman strength. So Dan, his wife, and the house painter started running into the house, but Johnny was chasing right behind them, and before they had the chance to lock the door, he was right there behind them, pushing the door open. And it was the three of them just putting all their weight on the door to try to keep him out, and finally it worked, and they were safe from him. They locked the door. They called the police. The police showed up, and when they got there, they found that apparently Johnny had left the Blackburn's house, gone back to the villa, and had somehow jumped or fallen from the roof, which was 15 feet high, and he was laying dead on the driveway below. He was 28 years old at the time of his death, and Katy was 81 years old at the time of her death. Now, there was no indication that Johnny had been pushed or that he jumped on purpose, so they ruled his death accidental. And his toxicology report came back 2 months later, which showed he had no drugs, no alcohol, no prescription meds in his system. Because prior to that report, lots of people were speculating that he must have been on something crazy, like bath salts. People were talking about all kinds of things, but he was on nothing. Absolutely nothing. After this all happened, the creator of Sons of Anarchy, whose name is Kurt Sutter, he tweeted the following, quote, "It was a tragic end for an extremely talented guy who unfortunately had lost his way. I wish I could say that I was shocked by the events last night, but I was not. I am deeply sorry that an innocent life had to be thrown into his destructive path. Yes, it's a day of mourning, but it's also 100% sure. And some people came out to criticize Scientology and saying that that might have had something to do with this whole situation, saying that the Church of Scientology is resistant to psychiatry, and that might be why he was untreated. But that's clearly not the case, because Johnny's father was not against him getting treatment from a psychiatrist or doctor or anyone who could help him. He was pushing for him to get treatment. And yes, Johnny was resistant. He wouldn't take the meds. He wouldn't go for the MRI. But whether or not that had to do with his Scientology beliefs, we don't know. It might have been just that he was already mentally ill, or was suffering from the brain injury, so he wasn't making proper decisions. I'm not sure which. So anyway, that is the case. What are your thoughts? I will share some of mine. First of all, rest in peace to Kathy, and my heart goes out to her friends and family. She sounded like such a wonderful, wonderful woman. She was so good to so many people, and she will definitely be remembered fondly. And I also will say rest in peace to Johnny Lewis, even though he was not the victim. He was actually the killer. But I do believe that regardless of how he became the way he was, whether it was from an injury or just a naturally occurring phenomenon, he was not in his right mind at all. I mean, clearly it made no sense what he was doing. From the sounds of it, he was acting like a wild animal who had rabies. You know, I apologize for using that kind of an analysis there, but it's just how I'm seeing it. Like he wasn't thinking, he wasn't behaving like a thinking human. He was behaving like a very, very sick and angry, vicious animal. And the fact that he had these superhuman strengths, and they said he also had like a very blank look on his face, and the neighbor Dan said that when he hit Johnny, it was as if he was hitting him with a fly swatter. It's like Johnny didn't even feel it. So I don't think he really knew right from wrong. And it is really unfortunate that his condition deteriorated to that point. So the first question I have is, why was a man like this just walking around unsupervised, living his life? I mean, look at all the things he had done up to this point. Clearly, he was a danger to himself and society. But yet, he was let out of jail after only 6 weeks. I mean, maybe he appeared okay on that day. It's possible, you know. He could have been having a good day when they interviewed him. And so they figured he's safe to go and it's too crowded here, and okay. And, you know, I would not fault his father. His father tried everything that he could to try to help Johnny. And you could say, well, why did Johnny's father let him move out on his own after coming out of jail? And then to that I would say, well, who said that it was up to Johnny's father, you know? Johnny was a 28-year-old man who was allowed to do what he wanted legally. Nobody was in charge of him, and he wanted to move into the villa. And yes, his father did help him, and he didn't tell Kathy that there was a problem. But I guess I would say, you know, who would have expected it would get this bad? I mean, he had done things previously, but nothing like murdering anybody, you know? He had hit some people with a bottle, he had punched somebody, he had broken into a few places. But it wasn't like he ever tried to kill anyone, so I would say his father did not see this coming at all, and I am sure he feels absolutely terrible. Now, the final question I have is, was it a head injury from the motorcycle crash, or was it a naturally occurring psychiatric disorder? And we're never going to know because they did not do an autopsy to figure that out. I would say that either it was the head injury or it is a huge, huge coincidence that his psychiatric